The 6th of June, 1944, 160,000 Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The operation that will break Nazi Germany's grip on Western Europe. Every historian knows this day. Every student learns this day. But here is the question almost nobody asks. Who built the army that landed on those beaches? Not Eisenhower. He commanded it. Not Patton. He fought in it. Not Bradley. He led it on the ground. The man who built that army, who trained its officers, designed its strategy, organized its logistics, and made it capable of defeating the most powerful military machine in history, was sitting in an office in Washington, D.C. on D-Day, reading reports. His name was George Catlett Marshall. And today, we are going to answer the question that military historians have been asking for 80 years. Why was George Marshall the most important soldier of World War II, and why does almost nobody know it? To understand Marshall, you must first understand the catastrophe he inherited. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and World War II officially began, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world. Let that number register. 17th. The U.S. Army had fewer active soldiers than Portugal, fewer than Romania, fewer than Belgium, a country Germany would conquer in 18 days. Why? The answer lies in American political psychology after World War I. World War I had killed 116,000 Americans. It had cost $32 billion, roughly $650 billion in today's money. And when it ended, most Americans concluded that Europe's wars were Europe's problem. Congress responded to this sentiment with budget cuts so severe that by 1939, American soldiers were training with wooden rifles because there weren't enough real ones. Some National Guard units were driving trucks with the word tank painted on the side because Congress had not funded actual tanks. The Army Air Corps, the future of warfare, had fewer than 1,800 aircraft. Germany had over 4,000 combat planes and was producing hundreds more every month. This was the military. George Marshall became Army Chief of Staff on the 1st of September, 1939. The same day Germany invaded Poland, the same day the war started. He had not one day to settle into the job before the crisis began. Here is what I find remarkable about this moment. Marshall knew before Pearl Harbor, before America was officially at war, that conflict was coming. He had been warning about it for years. But American democracy is slow. It requires consensus. It requires public opinion to shift. And between 1939 and 1941, a significant portion of the American public still believed the country could stay out of the war. Marshall had to rebuild an army, while a political debate raged about whether that army would ever be used. He had to conscript soldiers, secure funding, design training programs, and develop strategy, all while congressional isolationists were actively trying to cut his budget and reduce his authority. That is the invisible war Marshall was fighting before the first American shot was fired. The 14th of November, 1938. President Franklin Roosevelt calls a meeting at the White House. Subject: America's military preparedness. Roosevelt outlines his plan. Massive production of military aircraft, 10,000 planes per year. The Air Corps will be America's deterrent. Air power, he argues, is the future of warfare. Everyone in the room agrees. Generals, admirals, cabinet members, they nod. They express support. They offer refinements to the president's thinking. Then Roosevelt turns to a man he barely knows, a brigadier general who has just been brought to Washington, a man with no political allies in that room, no patrons in the White House, no reason to risk anything. Roosevelt says, almost casually, "Don't you think so, General Marshall?" Marshall says, "No, Mr. President, I don't. I want you to think about what that took." This is 1938. Franklin Roosevelt is at the height of his political power. He has just won re-election with 61% of the vote. He has been president for 5 years. He is surrounded by advisors who have learned that agreeing with Roosevelt is the path to influence and survival. And George Marshall, a man Roosevelt had met perhaps twice, told the President of the United States he was wrong. Not rudely, not dramatically, but clearly, directly, without hedging. Marshall explained, "Air power alone cannot win a war. You need ground forces. You need logistics. You need infantry and artillery and engineers. Aircraft without a strategy to use them is expensive theater." Roosevelt ended the meeting coldly. He barely acknowledged Marshall on the way out. Every person in that room assumed Marshall had just ended his own career. 2 weeks later, Roosevelt named Marshall Army Chief of Staff, skipping 34 more senior generals to do it. The lesson Roosevelt had learned in that room was simple. In a crisis, flattery is worthless. Truth is everything. And Marshall was the only man in the room willing to provide it. As Army Chief of Staff, Marshall now had authority, but he also had an army in desperate need of transformation. He began with what historians call the purge. Marshall maintained a physical notebook, 2 columns. On one side, officers who needed to be removed, men who were politically connected, personally loyal to him, or simply too old and too rigid in their thinking to fight a modern war. On the other side, young officers, unknown men, men who had demonstrated speed of thought, aggression, flexibility, qualities that WWII static trench warfare had not rewarded but that modern mechanized warfare demanded absolutely. The numbers tell the story. When Marshall became Chief of Staff, the average age of an American division commander was 58 years old. By 1942, he had reduced it to 42. By 1944, American combat commanders averaged 40 years old, younger than their German counterparts in many cases, faster, more adaptable. Why did this matter? Because the war Marshall saw coming was not the war of 1918. It was a war of armored columns moving hundreds of miles in days, of airborne operations behind enemy lines, of amphibious assaults against defended beaches. It required commanders who could make decisions in minutes, not hours, who could improvise when plans collapsed, as plans always do in combat. Marshall built that officer corps before the war started, the 7th of December, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor kills 2,403 Americans, wounds 1,178 more, and destroys or damages 19 naval vessels and 300 aircraft. The American public's reaction is unified and overwhelming. Destroy Japan. The Navy wants to go to the Pacific. Public opinion demands vengeance against Japan. Congress reflects that fury. Half of Roosevelt's advisors want to redirect military resources toward the Pacific theater immediately. George Marshall says, no, Germany first. Why? Marshall's strategic reasoning, presented to Roosevelt and the combined chiefs of staff, was this. Point 1. Germany possesses industrial and scientific capacity that Japan does not. German scientists are actively researching nuclear weapons. German engineers have developed V-2 ballistic missiles capable of reaching England from the European continent. If Germany develops nuclear weapons first, the war ends on German terms. Point 2. Britain is being strangled. German U-boats are sinking Allied shipping at a rate that threatens Britain's ability to continue fighting. If Britain falls or is forced to negotiate, America faces Nazi-controlled Europe and North Africa alone. Point 3. Japan cannot threaten the American mainland in any meaningful strategic sense. Japan's resources, oil, metals, food, are finite and already under pressure. Time works against Japan in the Pacific. Time works against the Allies in Europe. Therefore, Europe first. Destroy Germany. Then turn the full weight of American industrial production against Japan. Roosevelt adopts this strategy. Churchill agrees, though, for different reasons, involving the British Empire's interests. Stalin agrees he needs German pressure relieved on the Eastern Front immediately. Was Marshall right? The historical record suggests. Overwhelmingly, yes. Consider what the Europe First strategy accomplished. By November 1942, American and British forces invade North Africa. By July 1943, Sicily. By June 1944, France. By May 1945, Germany surrenders. That is 3 years from strategic decision to victory over the most powerful European military power in history. Now consider what would have happened with a Pacific First strategy. Japan, in 1942, controlled an empire stretching from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands. Defeating it required island-by-island combat across thousands of miles of ocean. Even with maximum resources, historians estimate Pacific First would have extended the war by 2 to 3 years minimum. During those additional years, Germany continues developing weapons technology. V-2 missiles are already operational by 1944. Nuclear research continues. The longer the war goes, the greater the risk that Germany develops a decisive weapon. Marshall understood this. He made the call that most of his contemporaries didn't want to make, and the war's outcome vindicated him completely. The most popular decision is rarely the correct one. The correct decision is rarely popular. That tension defined Marshall's entire career. Winston Churchill was one of the most formidable intellects of the 20th century, a Nobel Prize-winning author, a First Lord of the Admiralty, a man who had studied military history his entire life and had commanded forces in 4 continents. George Marshall and Winston Churchill disagreed fundamentally about how to defeat Nazi Germany, and their disagreement shaped the entire course of the war in Europe. Churchill's position: do not attempt a direct cross-channel invasion of France until Germany is significantly weakened. Attack instead at the periphery North Africa, then the Mediterranean, then Italy. Churchill called this the soft underbelly strategy. Churchill's reasoning was personal and strategic simultaneously. He had witnessed the slaughter of WWII's Western Front. He understood what static trench warfare against a fortified German line could cost. He was not willing to repeat that catastrophe. Marshall's position: strike directly, cross the English Channel, invade France, force a decisive battle with German forces in Western Europe, end the war quickly. Every month of delay costs lives, not just in combat, but in the Holocaust. Every month Germany controls France is a month German forces can reinforce defensive positions. Every month of peripheral operations in North Africa or Italy consumes resources without striking at Germany's strategic center of gravity. This is one of the most fascinating strategic debates in military history because both men had legitimate arguments. Churchill was right about the risks of a premature cross-channel invasion. In August 1942, British and Canadian forces launched Operation Jubilee, the Dieppe raid, against a single German-held port in France. Of the 6,000 troops who landed, 3,600 were killed, wounded, or captured within hours. German defensive positions were stronger than Allied intelligence estimated. The logistics of amphibious operations were more complex than anyone had fully planned for. Churchill pointed to Dieppe and said, "This is what a premature channel crossing looks like." But Marshall was right about the strategic necessity of confronting Germany directly. The Italian campaign, which followed Churchill's soft underbelly approach, consumed Allied resources for 2 years. Italian terrain, with its mountains and narrow valleys, made it impossible to employ the mechanized warfare that Allied forces had trained for. German forces defended expertly, retreating only when necessary, inflicting casualties far out of proportion to their own losses. Italy was not a soft underbelly. It was, as the soldiers who fought there called it, the hard spine. Marshall's instinct that you win wars by destroying the enemy's main force, not by maneuvering around its edges, was strategically sound. The compromise they reached was D-Day, the 6th of June 1944. By that point, Allied logistics, amphibious technology, air superiority, and officer training had all advanced to the point where the invasion was feasible. The delay Churchill imposed may have cost lives in 1942 and 1943. The preparation that delay permitted may have saved far more lives in 1944. Military history rarely offers clean answers. By late 1943, the Allied High Command has made its final decision. Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, will proceed in the spring of 1944. Someone must command it. The scale is unprecedented. 156,000 soldiers on the first day alone. Thousands of aircraft. Hundreds of naval vessels. Supply chains stretching across the Atlantic. The consensus among Allied leadership is near universal. The commander should be George Marshall. Churchill supports Marshall. Stalin at the Tehran Conference explicitly states he trusts Marshall more than any other Allied general. Roosevelt's own instinct points to Marshall. For Marshall, this would be the culmination of everything. A soldier's career measured by commands held, battles fought, campaigns led. Command of Overlord would place Marshall's name alongside Grant, Sherman, Pershing, the great commanders of American military history. Roosevelt meets privately with Marshall in Cairo. He asks carefully, "What do you want to do?" Marshall's reply has been recorded by multiple witnesses and confirmed in his own correspondence. He tells Roosevelt, "I will do whatever you decide is best for the country, Mr. President. The decision is yours and I will support it completely." Roosevelt presses him, "But what do you want? Personally?" Marshall says, "I would not be honest if I said I didn't want the command, but I don't think it's right for me to tell you what to assign me to. You must decide based on what serves the war effort best." Roosevelt makes his decision. Eisenhower will command Overlord. Marshall will remain in Washington as Army Chief of Staff. Roosevelt's reasoning, recorded in his own notes, "I could not sleep at night with Marshall out of Washington. I have spent considerable time with this moment." Marshall had spent 40 years in the United States Army. He had trained its officers. He had rebuilt it from near nothing. He had made every major strategic decision that shaped its deployment. And the final act, the invasion that would determine the war's outcome in Europe, would be commanded by a man Marshall himself had promoted, protected, and made possible. Eisenhower's career, to this point, was largely Marshall's creation. Marshall had elevated him over dozens of senior officers. Marshall had defended him when he made mistakes. Marshall had sent him to command in North Africa, then Sicily, then given him the authority that led to Overlord. And now Eisenhower would command the operation that would define the war while Marshall sat in an office in Washington. Was Roosevelt's decision correct? Almost certainly yes. Marshall in Washington was worth more than Marshall in the field. No other officer had his relationships with Congress, with Allied leaders, with Roosevelt himself. No other officer could manage the political and logistical architecture that sustained Allied operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. But knowing a decision is correct does not make it painless. Marshall returned to Washington and continued working. He never complained, not to Roosevelt, not to colleagues, not in private correspondence. He had turned down the most celebrated military command in American history because it wasn't his place to lobby for his own glory. That is either the most selfless act in American military history, or the most disciplined, or both. I believe it is both. While Marshall's strategic focus was Europe, the Pacific Theater required constant decisions with life and death consequences for hundreds of thousands of American soldiers and sailors. And Marshall's influence there was equally decisive. The question of MacArthur. General Douglas MacArthur, flamboyant, politically connected, personally ambitious, commanded Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur and Marshall had a complex, difficult relationship going back decades. MacArthur was Marshall's senior. MacArthur had been Army Chief of Staff, while Marshall was still a relatively obscure colonel. MacArthur publicly considered himself the superior officer and strategist. Marshall assessed MacArthur with the same cold precision he applied to every other general. What is this officer's value? What are his weaknesses? What command serves the war effort best? He kept MacArthur in the Pacific not out of deference, but because MacArthur's showmanship and political connections made him uniquely effective in that theater. He also kept MacArthur contained. When MacArthur attempted to expand his authority, when MacArthur lobbied for resources that Marshall had allocated elsewhere, when MacArthur's communiques to the press threatened to undermine Allied strategy, Marshall held the line, professionally, firmly, without personal animosity. The atomic bomb decision. By July 1945, Germany has surrendered. Japan has not. Military planners project that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. Japanese casualties would be catastrophically higher. The atomic bomb offers an alternative. Marshall's position in the internal debates is recorded in multiple classified documents that have since been declassified. He initially argues for a demonstration detonating the bomb on an uninhabited or lightly inhabited area as a warning before using it against a populated city. He is concerned about world opinion. He is concerned about the moral precedent. He is concerned about what it means for America's long-term international standing to be the first nation to use nuclear weapons against civilians. He is overruled. The bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Was Marshall right? This remains one of the most debated questions in the history of the war, and I am not going to tell you there is a simple answer. What I will tell you is this. The most powerful military officer in the United States Army wanted to warn Japan first, wanted to demonstrate the weapon before using it against a city. That detail deserves more attention than it typically receives. The 8th of May, 1945, VE Day. New York erupts. London erupts. The entire Allied world celebrates the end of the war in Europe. George Marshall is in his office in Washington, working. There are still operations to manage, still decisions to make, still the Pacific War to conclude. He does not celebrate publicly. He issues a brief statement. He thanks the soldiers, and he goes back to work. This is Marshall's paradox. The fact that explains both his extraordinary achievement and his historical invisibility. He was most valuable when nobody was watching him. Patton's genius was visible armored columns racing across France, headlines in every newspaper, newsreel cameras capturing his command presence. Eisenhower's genius was visible the politics of coalition command, the public face of Allied unity, the man the world could see as the symbol of victory. Marshall's genius was invisible. It happened in offices, in planning sessions, in budget negotiations, in the decisions about which officers to promote and which to remove, in the arguments with Churchill about strategy, in the testimony before Congress about resources. The man who built the army that won the war was invisible precisely because he did his job so well. Churchill understood this. In his history of World War II, Churchill called Marshall the organizer of victory. Not the victor, the organizer. The man who made victory possible. The man who created the conditions under which others could achieve it. I want to leave you with one final question. We live in an era that celebrates visibility. Achievement is measured in name recognition, in headlines, in the ability to claim credit. George Marshall operated by a completely different principle. He promoted Eisenhower because Eisenhower was the right commander, not because he was Marshall's ally or because it served Marshall's career. He turned down D-Day command because Washington needed him more than the battlefield did, even though command of D-Day would have secured his place in popular history forever. He refused to lobby for himself, even when Roosevelt gave him the opportunity. And when it was over, when the war was won, when the armies he had built had defeated the two most powerful military machines in history, he went home. No memoir claiming credit, no lecture tour, no campaign for the presidency that his popularity could easily have supported, just retirement. And then, when called again, the Marshall Plan, and then retirement again. The question worth asking is not, why does history forget George Marshall? The question worth asking is, what does it tell us about how we measure greatness that we forgot him at all? Military history tends to celebrate the commanders of battles, The men on the white horse, the dramatic figures whose names appear in dispatches. Marshall never appeared in dispatches, he wrote them. He won World War II, and he made sure everyone else got the credit. That is either a profound lesson in leadership or a profound failure of the world to recognize it properly. Probably both. George Catlett Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, 1939, 1945. Secretary of State, 1947, 1949. Nobel Peace Prize, 1953. The man who built the army that won the war. The man who rebuilt the continent that made the peace. The man history almost forgot. If this channel is about the cost of every decision, then Marshall's story is about the cost of doing everything right and letting others take the credit. Subscribe, and in the next video, we continue.